Hey, everybody. It is Monday, December 8th. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Wanunu.
And I am Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. And sometimes we watch the sports on the weekends, Jill.
Sometimes we do, Moshe, including this past weekend, a big sports weekend when it comes to college football. And the playoff bracket has officially been set.
Yeah, and this, as someone who grew up in a Big Ten area, Jill, was a surprising headline. The Indiana Hoosiers, number one, beating Ohio State 13-10 over the weekend to win the first Big Ten championship for the Hoosiers since 1967, the first outright title since 1945. We've known Indiana for its basketball, not so much for its football, but Jill, it came at the expense of Ohio State, which I know they're sort of a big deal in your house. How's everything going?
Sort of a big deal. They are the deal in my house.
The only deal.
And you know what? My husband is actually okay. He would have obviously preferred Ohio State to have won, but they're still in the playoffs and the season is not over.
Right, because we have entered this college football playoff era. 12 teams make the playoffs. The top four get a bye. So that's Indiana at 1, Ohio State 2, followed by Georgia and Texas Tech. They go straight to the quarterfinals. They don't have to deal with any more football for at least a few weeks. Then there's the first round games, which happen a week from this weekend. So the weekend of the 19th and 20th. And the 8 teams playing there for their chance to take on the top 4 and then ultimately lead to the championship. Those 8 teams are James Madison and Oregon, who will play against one another. Then you'll have Alabama versus Oklahoma, Tulane versus Ole Miss, and Miami versus Texas A&M. So it'll be an interesting few weeks to follow if you're big into the college football world. And we'll bring you those results as they happen.
We've got a little time, Moshe.
We have some time. The biggest games will happen starting, New Year's Eve, New Year's, and then, that first week of January.
Okay, let's get to some headlines here, starting with the economy. More than 1 million people were laid off from their jobs in 2025, according to some new data, just as some Trump voters are beginning to blame him for high prices. But Trump is calling any criticism when it comes to affordability a, quote, con job by Democrats.
And it comes as the White House is looking to put Trump out across the country in the coming days to discuss the economy.
Big media news, Netflix announcing a deal to buy Warner Brothers Discovery, including HBO and Max. So what is behind this move by Netflix? The question about whether this is a monopoly, and most importantly, how this can impact all of us, the consumers. In Washington, D.C., the Supreme Court says that it will rule on Trump's bid to end birthright citizenship next year. And starting today, the court will hear arguments over whether the president has executive power to fire the leaders of independent agencies. Plus, RFK Jr.'s new vaccine panel says that not all babies need the hepatitis B vaccine at birth. The recommendation now goes to the CDC for approval. What exactly this all means? And we'll break down a new bill introduced by a Republican senator to eliminate dual citizenship, what that would mean for the more than 40 million Americans who have dual citizenship. And Sean Diddy Combs criticizing the new Netflix docuseries about him, calling it a shameful hit piece. Moshe, I know you watched the documentary over the weekend and you've got all of the details and the controversy.
Jill, it really puts into perspective what we've seen unfold the last 30 years and reframes it.
And Moshe is on this day in history.
Jill, not so long ago on this day in history, it was inappropriate and unacceptable to say the word pregnant on television. We'll have that on this day in history.
Okay, today's top story. Some new numbers out in recent days show that 2025 has seen the highest number of layoffs since 2020. That was the peak of the pandemic. And if you put 2020 to the side as an outlier, this year has seen the highest number of job cuts since 2009, just after the financial crash. So from January to November, companies have cut nearly 1.2 million jobs. That is up 54% from 2024. And it is according to outplacement firm Challenger, Gray, and Christmas. They attributed the cuts to corporate restructuring, artificial intelligence, and Trump's tariffs. Tariffs are having a disproportionate impact on small businesses. More than 10% of the cuts have come to tech businesses, which is where AI has been a notable factor. Nearly 55,000 job cut announcements reportedly tied to AI this year. Then there's a separate report this week on private business payrolls from ADP, which showed that small businesses were actually leading the decline when it came to jobs, a concerning result highlighting growing inequality between large and small companies. The new data comes as Americans are speaking out about the affordability crisis and increasingly pointing fingers at President Trump. A recent Politico poll showed an increasing number of Americans blame President Trump for the high costs they are seeing at grocery stores, restaurants, during holiday shopping season, and virtually in all aspects of life. So almost half of those surveyed, 46%, say the cost of living for Americans feels the worst that they can ever remember it, which includes nearly 4 in 10 voters who cast a ballot for Trump in 2024. More Americans say Trump holds most or all responsibility for the economy. 29% of voters, though, still say a majority of the blame goes to former President Joe Biden. Notably, 1 in 4 Trump voters, though, now say Trump is mainly to blame for the state of the economy. The numbers show a potential problem for Trump and Republicans ahead of the 2026 midterm elections. The Republican base is growing more frustrated with the high cost of living and an unpredictable economy. Democrats were successful in capturing this frustration during key races in this off-year election. They won elections in New Jersey and Virginia and overperformed in a deep red House seat in Tennessee, largely because the campaigns were focused on the affordability crisis. And it is clear that Democrats plan on continuing that message ahead of the midterms.
Yeah, and it wasn't so long ago that a candidate named Donald Trump was running on affordability. He was going after Biden and Harris on inflation, saying prices will come down when I'm president. But there is a perception out there that he has been more focused on foreign affairs, right? He's trying to become the peace president, ending these conflicts, and things like building a ballroom at the White House, and not as focused, at least based on the perceptions here. You're seeing in numbers across the board. A Fox News poll showed some similar numbers recently that he's spending enough time on affordability. Now, the president and his team have been citing that the price of gas is down this year. The price of eggs have come down this year. They're also noting the record spending consumers engaged in on Black Friday. And of course, he's brought down the cost of some medications due to some deals that he struck with some of the larger pharma companies. But the price of everything else appears up, and that's the larger perception issue he's facing here. Jill, it's very interesting to see what's unfolding here because it feels similar to what you would hear from the Biden White House. Well, like, why don't people understand that, like, the economy is in a good place and we're doing good things? And you're hearing a bit of that from the Trump White House here. And the messaging has been a bit all over the place because at the same time, he at times has called himself the affordability president, especially coming out of the Zohran Mamdani victory in New York City, where Mamdani did so well on the affordability argument. But then last week, he was out there multiple times saying the word affordability is a, quote, con job by the Democrats. Here's a bit of what Trump said on Tuesday during cabinet meeting.
The word affordability is a con job by the Democrats. They say affordable. I watched the other day where some very low IQ congresswoman talked about affordability. She had no idea. Their prices were much higher. As an example, energy, gasoline, we're now at about $2.50 a gallon. We're going to be, I think, at $2 a gallon. We could even crack that at some point. I'd love to do it. And we could do it more easily if we weren't building up the strategic national reserves, which Biden emptied out before the election so that he could try and get elected.
And that wasn't the only time that he used that term. Look for that con job clip to be used in many campaign ads this summer and fall, Jill, where people just kind of play that over and over again. Affordability is a con job. Affordability is a con job. Because at the end of the day, when you look at the American electorate, there was a good Axios piece on this last week. About a third of Americans will always vote Democrat. About a third of Americans will always vote Republican. And then you have that third in the middle that tends to flip, right? And we see that all the time. We went from Clinton to Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden to Trump. RD. And you see it all the times in the first midterms where the country will elect one leader, Obama in 2008, and then give the House to Republicans in 2010. They'll elect Trump in 2016 give the House to Democrats in 2018. Biden in 2020, give the House to Republicans in 2022. You see where we're going here. So ultimately, Republicans around Trump and folks at the White House know they have a problem here, which is why over the weekend, Trump signed an executive order to establish a food supply chain security task force that will address what they believe might be price fixing and anti-competitive behavior in the food supply industry. If that sounds familiar, that's something President Biden did and was criticized by Republicans for, saying, we're going to go after price fixing in the food world, and that'll help bring prices down. Trump also has eased some of his tariffs in recent weeks, tariffs on Brazilian coffee, fruit, beef, all in an effort to lower grocery prices. Also, we told you last week about new fuel efficiency rollbacks, hoping that by not requiring car manufacturers to take things up to 50 miles per gallon requirements that Biden had issued in the coming years, that ultimately the car companies not having to do that will not have to raise the price of vehicles even more, and that savings might go back to consumers. But we know this, we've seen this, when the economy is bad, or at least when people perceive it to be bad, ultimately they tend to blame the guy in the White House and tend to favor the other party in midterm elections, which is why this is going to be so interesting to watch and why the White House has Trump out on the campaign trail on Tuesday. He'll be visiting Northeast Pennsylvania. And that's notable because Trump, for the most part, has spent very little time out in the country doing his normal kind of campaign rallies. He did a lot of that in his first term, did a lot on the campaign trail. Not so much during his first term in office. Spent a lot of time at his clubs in Mar-a-Lago, New Jersey, foreign trips. And so getting him out there in front of people, again, is something the White House hopes will help have him plug back into these issues.
Okay, moving on to the biggest story in media. Netflix announced that it is spending $82 billion to buy Warner Brothers Discovery's film and television studio, which also owns HBO and HBO Max. If the deal goes through, it would be one of the largest entertainment mergers ever. The acquisition would give Netflix the deepest well of premium franchises outside of Disney and dramatically expand its original content pipeline. The Warner Brothers library includes everything from Harry Potter, the DC Universe, The Wizard of Oz, Casablanca, Citizen Kane, The Big Bang Theory, and Friends.
I've heard of a few of those.
They've got range, Moshe. It would also acquire HBO classics like The Sopranos, Game of Thrones, Veep, and Sex and the City, plus HBO Max's recent shows like White Lotus and Succession. One Bank of America report summed up what's at stake, saying, quote, if Netflix acquires Warner Brothers, the streaming wars are effectively over.
Yeah, just to put it in perspective here, Netflix is the number one streamer. HBO Max is the number 3 streamer. We should note Amazon's the number 2 streamer in between them, but we don't really consider Amazon a streaming company. So this is effectively the most serious, stream first, entertainment, content first companies, Netflix and HBO Max getting together.
So this merger would create a combined 45% streaming market share, which will likely face significant regulatory hurdles. So the deal is far from complete. There's been major pushback on the merger, including from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. U.S. government regulators would also examine whether this deal makes Netflix a monopoly, potentially limiting competition and driving up prices. CNBC is reporting that the White House is looking at the deal with, quote, heavy skepticism. But the head of Netflix, Ted Sarandos, recently met with Trump. According to a new Bloomberg report, Netflix stock is up overall this year, but it did tick down about 3% Friday amid news of the planned acquisition. The deal also includes a nearly $6 billion breakup fee that Netflix agreed to pay Warner Brothers Discovery if the deal falls apart or does not win regulatory approval.
Yeah, and investors, shareholders in Netflix, not loving this deal so far. One of the reasons why you saw the stock down there, it's largely debt financed. They see this as a big overpayment by Netflix. Keep in mind, Netflix has gotten to this point in time with little to no acquisitions, Jill. This is all, they built themselves up. And it is interesting because it wasn't so long ago, just over a decade ago, that the then head of Warner Brothers referred to Netflix as the Albanian army. When people said, are you worried about Netflix? He's like, yeah, I'm as worried about them as anyone is about the Albanian military. A little over a decade later, the Albanian military has paid $82 billion to buy Warner Brothers. So just goes to show you, Jill, there's a lot of those stories when it comes to the tech industry. There's a in a side here, a quote from Steve Ballmer at Microsoft when the iPhone first came out. where a reporter asked him, "Are you worried about this iPhone?" And Ballmer at Microsoft said, "The iPhone, it doesn't even have a keyboard. Why should I worry about that? That seems ridiculous." Well, we know where that ended up too. So it's interesting here. Netflix has been underestimated by a number of companies. Blockbuster, remember Blockbuster? Among them here. And now they've gotten to the point where even before this acquisition, Jill, there's already concern that Netflix is already too large. Hollywood already concerned about the power, the weight that they have in the industry. And so investors are like, yeah, Netflix, was this worth $82 billion to you? Because ultimately you are a streamer first. And now you have to worry about the Warner Brothers movie studio. You have to worry about theatrical releases. You have to worry about everything that it takes to, be a studio here. Whereas you've sort of built up your own thing over time. Being a studio now or running a studio in Warner Brothers means you got to spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year to produce and market movies. And then there's a larger concern that, all this regulatory scrutiny is going to just be an issue here for Netflix. You do have a lot of people coming out against this, Jill, among them the theater industry, very worried now that Netflix owning Warner Brothers means that what has already been a shortened window for many movies to go to the theater will get tightened up even further because Netflix is going to be incentivized to get those movies out and bring them straight to streaming or very quickly to streaming. Talking about like a 1 week window in theaters or a 2 week window in theaters and then quickly moving them to streaming. So the theater industry, very concerned, sending letters to Congress. You have a lot of Hollywood executives who are very worried about this. Jill, Ben Stiller, the actor, was over on X this weekend engaging in a dialogue about how concerned he is and how concerned actors and a number of people are across Hollywood that as you have fewer and fewer studios here getting acquired by the big guys, that it's going to be a challenge industry-wide here.
Important to mention that before any sale can actually close, Warner Brothers Discovery is planning to split into two companies. It will become Warner Brothers, the movie studio, and Discovery Global, which will house its cable networks like CNN and TNT. The acquisition is expected to close after the separation takes place. That's expected in the third quarter of next year. And while we mentioned this merger is under scrutiny, Paramount and Comcast, which are two other media companies that are also known to have submitted offers for Warner Brothers Discovery, they may still try to continue to pursue the company in case a deal with Netflix falls through. Paramount was thought to be the front runner for a while before Netflix swooped in with this offer that is a mostly cash offer. So perhaps that is what sweetened this pot for them.
It was the biggest offer for Warner Brothers, which, by the way, if you're thinking, didn't I hear recently about Warner Brothers Discovery, like dealing with a merger? Yes, you did. Like 3 years ago when AT&T spun off certain assets and this Warner Brothers Discovery thing came together, David Zaslav, who runs Warner Brothers Discovery, wasn't even, urgently looking for a suitor. And you had Paramount sort of come in here, David Ellison, a different David, who just acquired CBS and all of Paramount, quickly making moves here saying, I want to buy you too. And that then led to this whole situation unfolding over the last couple months. And then Netflix, which wasn't even thinking about this as recently as October, was like, maybe let's buy them. And so they made this deal, and Paramount may still go with a hostile bid. Paramount also has lots of connections to the White House. David Ellison, his dad is Larry Ellison, one of the richest people in the world, very close to Donald Trump. And so there's a lot of questions here about what might happen behind the scenes. Trump, of course, used to have his own reality show, very interested in all things media. This is something that he will closely watch, and we'll see how the various players here might have to deal directly with the president on this matter when it comes to approval. One theory of the case here too, Jill, this is the very cynical view, is that Netflix might know all along that they might actually not get this, that they might not win this. Even with the $6 billion kill fee they would have to pay if this thing doesn't go through. What it does, again, we saw this theory during a discussion over on the Inkler website over the weekend, which covers entertainment, that this effectively freezes HBO Max, a main competitor, for about 2 years, because when you're being purchased, you can't make any major moves. So if, as like a cynical case, this sort of freezes HBO Max, freezes a competitor from making any major moves while you continue to consolidate, continue to do your thing. And so ultimately, is this just like we're going to keep this out of everybody else's hands, and we freeze a competitor, and that helps us for a bit, even if we lose this.
Shrewd move, Netflix.
But either way, Jill, it's going to be a super interesting story to watch. And the reason why we talk about it here, we don't often cover like major mergers and acquisitions is because I would say that probably the majority of you in this audience subscribe to at least one of those streamers, if not two of them. And this is a test case for Washington when it comes to big tech companies that are now worth hundreds of billions of dollars or trillions of dollars, and how big the government is willing to let them get over time, and what it means to all of us, and what we'll be paying monthly for content. We were talking about this in the AMA podcast over the weekend that we put out for premium users. A Netflix, HBO Max, like once they're in, they can raise prices to a certain extent. There's fewer competitors, right? So, the argument is, will this become even more expensive for consumers? And just like, years ago, you used to pay for streaming and used to get your content with no ads. And then they're like, you know what? You're going to pay that and you're getting ads. If you don't want the ads, you're going to pay even more now. Will they continue to add more and more tiers here over time? So this will be closely watched. And I think it's super interesting to both, all of you, Wall Street, Hollywood, and Washington. It's one of those few stories that checks all those boxes.
I'm just thinking about how we are never getting another classic rom-com in the theater. It's just not happening.
No, right. Well, and that's it. Is not just rom-com in the theater, Jill. Is the theater done?
On the next episode of Mo News. Okay, time for the speed read from Politico. The Supreme Court has agreed to hear a case on whether President Trump's executive order ending automatic birthright citizenship for anyone born in the United States is unconstitutional. The justices announced Friday that they will take up the issue this term. Arguments will likely be in April, with a decision expected by the end of June. The case stems from an executive order that Trump signed hours after he was inaugurated in January. It declared that children of undocumented immigrants and foreigners on most visas would no longer be entitled to U.S. citizenship, birthright citizenship, the idea that virtually all children born on American soil are automatically citizens, regardless of the status of their parents, has long been considered a core tenet of this country. The president said, though, that the order was needed to discourage illegal immigration and what's called birth tourism, saying that pregnant women are coming to the United States before their child's birth solely to gain U.S. citizenship for their children. Trump's order is currently on hold because of several legal challenges. Federal judges on lower courts across the country ruled the policy is at odds with the Constitution's 14th Amendment, which guarantees citizenship to anyone born on U.S. soil. So far, an 1898 Supreme Court ruling has also been seen as guaranteeing citizenship to virtually everyone born in the U.S. Trump's executive order did not directly seek to strip U.S. citizenship from people who already had it, but it would take effect for all babies born in the future. But the administration's legal arguments call into question the citizenship of anyone born in the U.S. without at least one U.S. citizen parent at the time they were born.
Right. Is there a slippery slope here is one of the big questions. Now, this whole idea of anyone born here, regardless of their parents' circumstances or legality, making them a citizen is actually pretty rare among most developed countries, but it's grounded, as you mentioned, in the 14th Amendment, which was ratified after the Civil War and was meant to give citizenship to all the slaves, to all Black Americans who were here. Now, allies of Trump have argued that the 14th Amendment was intended specifically for the formerly enslaved people and their children, and has been wrongly interpreted over time to apply to everyone who is born here, even if they have undocumented status. So this is one of those cases we told you would end up at the Supreme Court. And again, as you mentioned, all the lower courts so far have ruled against the president. So it'll be super interesting to see how the administration makes their argument here, especially since he's trying to do this by executive order. And, some legal analysts have said to do this, you would need a constitutional amendment, given how the 14th Amendment has been interpreted. So that's something we're going to watch going into June. But in the meantime, the Supreme Court today will be hearing arguments on another important case regarding the Trump administration, whether he has the ability to fire the heads of independent agencies like the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Communications Commission. We've had these semi-independent agencies for years, and Trump is testing the waters here to see whether he can go so far as to fire the heads of it, to take more control of these agencies. This case the court is going to be hearing centers around his firing of the former commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission, as well as his attempt to remove Lisa Cook, the Federal Reserve governor, the woman who's on the Federal Reserve, who's been trying to fire or be fired, but she's still there. Presidents have historically been blocked from firing the heads of independent agencies. That goes back to a Supreme Court case back in 1935. But the Trump administration is looking for a reinterpretation of that. So look out for coverage of that on the Instagram page today.
Over in health news from the Mo newsletter, a panel of federal vaccine advisors handpicked by Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. voted on Friday to end the decades-long recommendation that all newborn babies be immunized at birth against hepatitis B. In an 8-3 vote, the panel decided to recommend a dose at birth only for infants whose mothers test positive for Hep B at birth. For babies who do not receive the birth dose, the committee recommended that they wait to receive a first vaccine until they are at least 2 months old. The hepatitis B vaccine is known to be a safe and effective protection against the incurable virus. It could lead to liver disease, cancer, and early death. The vote marks a major break from decades of public health practice. Supporters fear that infants could be left unprotected, while the panel argues the birth dose is not needed, raising questions about how the change will play out. The advisory committee specifically recommended that parents make their own decisions in consultation with the healthcare provider to determine when or if to give the first hepatitis B vaccine dose to a child. That is the advice specifically when the child's mother has tested negative for the virus during pregnancy or birth. Since 1991, the CDC has recommended all newborn babies get the shot, and that has led to a steep decline in hepatitis B rates among children since that recommendation was introduced, along with some other mandates. Important to note, parents can still choose to vaccinate their child at birth, even with this new recommendation.
Yeah, this is not a matter of yes or no, but when? At birth or at 2 months. But ultimately, decisions here will now flow up to the CDC. The CDC now has to take this under advisement, and then it goes to the states. The concern some people have is that if the CDC follows through with this, and some states follow through with this, that will lead insurers to no longer feel obligated to have to provide coverage for the Hep V vaccine at birth. One of the other concerns from some folks in the medical world is that, you have folks in the hospital, you can get them the Hep B shot, but some people are not as good about then going to the pediatrician and following up on the various vaccines over time. So we will await here what the CDC does about this, what the states then do about this, how the various states handle this issue. At the same time, the American Academy of Pediatrics still advocates for the birth dose, saying a delay will leave young children at risk of an infection that could cause lifelong illness. At the same time, people who stand by this vaccine advisory board decision say it makes sense to give the vaccine to kids of mothers who have Hep B, but ultimately waiting 2 months for the babies of moms who are negative is okay as far as they're concerned.
From Forbes magazine, a story many of you have been writing in about over on the Instagram account, a Republican senator has introduced a bill to end dual citizenship in the United States. The bill is called the Exclusive Citizenship Act of 2025. Its passage means that you wouldn't be allowed to stay a citizen or national of the U.S. while also having any other foreign citizenship. Ohio Senator Bernie Moreno introduced the bill in recent weeks. It says existing dual citizens would have 1 year to renounce their foreign citizenships or give up their U.S. citizenship. And if they didn't renounce their foreign citizenship within that 1 year period, they would essentially be voluntarily giving up their U.S. citizenship. It's estimated about 40 million Americans are eligible for dual citizenship. Senator Moreno has said the bill is to ensure, quote, sole and exclusive allegiance to the United States. Moreno was born in Colombia. He renounced his Colombia citizenship at the age of 18 when he became a U.S. citizen. He has described U.S. citizenship as an honor and a privilege that should not be shared with another nation. Moshe, I know you got a ton of questions this week about whether this bill is likely to pass, and you discussed it at length on this past week's AMA podcast. That's our weekly Q&A Ask Me Anything podcast for Mo News Premium members. What can you tell us?
Okay, the bottom line here, Jill, is this bill is the longest of long shots right now. I know it has a lot of people concerned, but there are a lot of speed bumps, or I would say larger than speed bumps, huge hills this would have to get over. The bill challenges decades of Supreme Court precedent protecting citizens of involuntary loss of nationality. Multiple cases over the decades have been instrumental in establishing dual citizenship as a constitutional right. And many scholars of the Constitution note that these cases will protect dual citizenship. You can go back to a case in 1795 about foreign citizenship. You can go back to a case from 1967. saying that a U.S. citizen cannot lose their citizenship unless they willingly surrender it. Of note here, Jill, one of the reasons why I'm skeptical this bill will go very far, among the people with dual citizenship, Melania Trump, our first lady, as well as her son, Barron Trump. They both have U.S. and Slovenian nationality, among many other folks in the government who have dual citizenship. And so the Moreno bill goes to the Senate committee process. They would need to get a majority of senators to approve this. It would then have to be approved by a majority of the House. It then would have to be signed into law by President Trump, effectively challenging his wife and son to give up their Slovenian citizenship. I guess they might do so willingly, but I just feel like when you look at how many people are impacted by this, and again, no urgent situation leading to an argument being like, we need to get rid of dual citizenship. There's a major loyalty problem in this country. There are challenges here. And so it leads what I discussed over on the other podcast, many to believe that this is more about grabbing headlines for a certain senator and not necessarily a realistic legislation that you see passing anytime soon.
Okay, now to some news about the most streamed show on Netflix this weekend, the new documentary out about Sean Combs, aka Diddy. From TMZ, Diddy and his camp are reportedly livid over this new Netflix documentary about him. It recently hit #1 on the streaming platform. The docuseries is called Diddy: The Reckoning. It was produced in part by 50 Cent, one of Diddy's longtime rivals. It shows never before seen footage of the rap mogul that was actually taken by a videographer that Diddy hired just before his September 2024 arrest. His team say the footage was never authorized for release and called it illegal. One of the opening scenes of the documentary uses this footage. It shows Combs complaining about all of the lawsuits and the federal investigations into him, saying that he wants to, quote, fight for his life. So it shows him talking pretty candidly to his attorney. Filmmakers noted on screen that they obtained the footage after Diddy's arrest for sex trafficking and racketeering. Apparently, there was a dispute between the videographer and Diddy about pay, which then led to somehow Netflix or 50 Cent purchasing this footage and getting it into the documentary.
Yeah, 50 Cent was asked about this last week, and he wouldn't disclose. He told the reporter, he's like, you don't disclose all your sources. I'm not disclosing all of mine. But reiterating that the way they obtained this footage, that again, Diddy hired a videographer to take of him, was totally legal. Diddy's estate, again, calling this stolen footage.
Some background on Diddy. His arrest centered around allegations that he coerced his former girlfriends into sexual encounters with hired male escorts and orchestrated drug-fueled sex parties that he called freak-offs. He was ultimately acquitted of the most serious sex trafficking and racketeering charges, but was convicted of 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution after his trial in July. He was sentenced to just over 4 years in prison, with some of that time already served. He is expected to get out in the spring of 2028. Now, following criticism from Diddy, Netflix is insisting their new series is not a hit piece or an act of retribution. Moshe, you watched the 4-part series over the weekend. What did you think?
So it is very critical of Diddy, but yeah, I wouldn't call it a hit piece. I would just say that it's a new perspective on him. It's both fascinating and very disturbing, Jill. It really resets the last few decades, especially if you've been following, well, it's hard not to follow someone like him, right? But following him through the decades, through music, through Sean John, through his reality shows, all the various things Diddy's been up to the last few decades. And it takes you through why, with a certain amount of money and power and threats, you saw where Diddy was able to get where he is, and why so many for so long were so scared about speaking openly about him, especially as people looked at this, was like, wait, these are accusations, some of them from the 90s, but just the power he had and the threats he made against people. The documentary includes interviews with some of the women who have accused him of sexual assault. It dives into a few of those storylines. Now, he has dozens of civil cases still pending against him, some of them with statute of limitations issues, and many of them have not been resolved yet. There's also interviews with the male prostitutes who were engaged in those so-called freak-offs that provide new perspective there. It details the abuse of his former girlfriend for years, Cassie, who testified at his trial and was effectively the courageous one who was able to come out against him. And interestingly, it goes back to his childhood, Jill. His father was murdered, his abusive mother. And you get a sense of the origins of Sean Combs as he became Puff Daddy and then Diddy. And also, for those of you interested in the sort of 90s hip hop, the West Coast, East Coast rivalry, which would lead to the murders of both Tupac and Notorious B.I.G., it reframes what took place there and includes tapes of a police interview of a former gang member claiming that it was Sean Combs who offered him $1 million for a hit on Tupac, and the record executive who ran his record label, Suge Knight. The way they frame it, Jill, it actually was Notorious B.I.G. and Tupac who had the close friendship. Diddy was jealous of their friendship, wanted to make Notorious B.I.G. more loyal to him. And so part of the way that the documentary, without getting into too many details here, frames as that Diddy was trying to break them up effectively. He helped spur this rivalry between them. And then there's, if you've seen these memes over the weekend, the fact that they reveal or they allege in the documentary that Diddy made Notorious B.I.G.'s family to pay for his own funeral, even though it was Diddy who made this huge, super expensive funeral, was able to then launch to stardom in the aftermath of B.I.G.'s death. No longer in a shadow, though constantly framing himself as his best friend. So again, it completely reframes a number of things. I can see why the Diddy estate and Diddy might be particularly upset by it. But it's interesting because 50 Cent says that he thinks Diddy will ultimately see the truth in it. He says, and even like the documentary. I do not see that happening, Fiddy, but understand the
Keep telling yourself that.
Keep telling yourself that. But it's super interesting, and it lays out all these various people who over time were with Diddy and then were no longer friends with him through the decades. And it helps you make sense of, again, the last 3 decades. Jill, it reminded me of the time when Diddy and J-Lo were dating. It's just super interesting if you're, if you live through all of this, especially if you're sort of, millennial, elder millennial and above, and you experienced a lot of this history in the 90s and early 2000s. Super interesting to see it through the lens of this documentary.
Moshe, you're kind of blowing my mind because I am a 90s kid who lived through all of this history. And I am just thinking how Diddy really blew up as a rapper himself with I'll Be Missing You, which he did with Faith Evans about Biggie's death.
Jill, they show the moment that was really the breakout moment for Diddy. Now you see how dark it was. It was the aftermath of his friend's death. He's got Sting on stage singing Every Breath I Take. Diddy's dancing around, and that was really his launch to stardom. He got a Rolling Stone cover that was essentially intended for Notorious B.I.G., but B.I.G. Was killed just before then. So just watching this documentary, again, just in the way that we've sort of seen history until now, reframing in certain ways, I think is a revelatory. And so, again, even if you have sort of some interest in this period of time, I think it's super interesting and yes, at times very super disturbing. Speaking of history, that brings us to On This Day in History. On This Day in History in 1941, December 8th, 1941, FDR officially declared war on Japan the day after Pearl Harbor, which took place on December 7th. He declares in a speech before Congress that is broadcast across the nation on radio that December 7th was a day that'll live in infamy and that the U.S., now deliberately attacked by the Japanese, will take on the Empire of Japan. Interestingly, Jill, once we declare war on the Japanese, that's when Hitler and Nazi Germany declare war on us due to their alliance with Japan. There's many people who wonder in alternate history if the Nazis don't decide to declare war on us, whether the U.S. gets involved in Europe at that point. So ultimately, within days here, the U.S. would begin a joint effort to take out the Imperial Empire of Japan and Nazi Germany. On this day in 1980, a huge loss in the world of music. John Lennon shot and killed by an obsessed fan in New York City. The 40-year-old John Lennon was just entering his New York City apartment on this day, December 8th, when Mark David Chapman shot him 4 times at close range with a revolver. Psychiatrists would later deem that Chapman was a borderline psychotic. He was instructed to plead insanity, but instead he pleaded guilty to murder. He was initially sentenced to 20 years in prison, Jill, but when the 20 years came up, they didn't let him out due to their concerns about him, that he should not be a free man. And so Mark David Chapman, to this day, is still in prison, 45 years or so in prison. He just turned 70 years old, apparently partially inspired by the Holden Caulfield character in Catcher in the Rye. And that famous photo of John Lennon nude hugging Yoko was actually taken on this day in history, the morning before he was assassinated. And then fast forward a little bit, on this day last year, after 13 years of civil war, Bashar Assad, the dictator of Syria, was ousted as the ruler of Syria, a story we've been covering very heavily over the last year. But remarkable, Jill, how much difference a year makes. That was just a year ago today.
Moshe, I love that we're keeping on this day fresh.
Trying my best. There's nothing fresher than on this day 1 year ago.
1 year ago today, yeah.
As we go into pop culture history here, we go a little farther back, though. On this day 73 years ago, on I Love Lucy, in primetime, Lucy learns that she's expecting a child. The actress, Lucille Ball, happened to be pregnant at the time, so they felt like they had to reveal it on TV because her character was showing. But interesting fact, as of 1952, CBS thought using the word pregnant was inappropriate on primetime television, so they had to use a bunch of euphemisms like expecting and other words. They couldn't use the word pregnant, and CBS still had a policy, this goes back to the 1930s, of having a minister and a priest approve the script language to ensure it wouldn't offend sensibilities across the country. This is one of those things, Jill, that if the public had known about it, say there was like social media in the 1950s, people say, like, the majority of people would have been like, that's ridiculous. Like, we could handle the word pregnant. But at the time, TV networks still felt they had to, censor to the extreme here and couldn't use the word pregnant. Of course, that would change just a few years later. By the 1960s, the word pregnant was used all the time.
I'm thinking, what are they saying? Bun in the oven? Expecting.
You can go back and watch the I Love Lucy episodes, Jill, and you can go through all the various terms they use that didn't include the word pregnant. Finally, on this day in history, Jill, actually, this is another one from just a year ago. On this day in 2024, Taylor Swift staged the 149th and final show of her Eras tour, selling a record-setting $2 billion in tickets overall. So Bashar Assad, no longer the dictator, Taylor Swift finishing the Eras tour on this day 1 year ago.
And 1 year later, engaged and going to be married.
We're talking about Taylor Swift, not Bashar Assad.
I don't know what's up with his personal life. All right, that does it for this Monday edition of the Mo News Podcast. Thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us, subscribe so you do not miss an episode, and review us in the App Store. Those reviews really do help. We appreciate them.
See everyone back here tomorrow.